Section 1. The Christmas Card That Started an Empire. There's a quiet magic in the story of how the most controversial cartoon in television history began. Not in a boardroom, not in a pitch meeting, not with executives and focus groups and market research. It began in a film class in Colorado, with construction paper, a pair of scissors, a bottle of glue, and two college students who made each other laugh. Let that settle in for a second. The show that would one day receive an official condemnation from the White House, the show that China erased from its entire internet, the show that survived death threats and Scientology lawyers, and the full weight of network censorship, all of it, every bit of it, started with construction paper in 1992. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met in a film class at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Parker was a music major from Conifer, Colorado, a small mountain town so close to the real South Park Basin that you could practically see it from his front porch on a clear day. Stone was a mathematics and film major from Littleton, also in Colorado, a kid who had grown up in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains just like Parker had. They were assigned to work on student film projects together, and somewhere in between, running cameras and recording sound for other people's boring films, they started doing voices. Silly voices. Ridiculous little kid voices that cracked each other up. Parker has talked about this in interviews. He said they would talk like these tiny children to amuse each other, and they did it for a full year before they ever thought to actually put anything on film. Hey, that's not the origin story of people trying to build a franchise. That's two bored college kids goofing around in a film department hallway doing bits that only the two of them found funny. What they shared, beyond the Colorado mountains and the comedy instincts, was a love of Monty Python. Both of them cite Python as one of their primary influences, and you can feel it in the DNA of South Park even now. That mix of absurdist logic, class commentary, and jokes that go on about 30 seconds longer than they should, all of it has that same comfortable British chaos that made Monty Python so enduring. But Parker and Stone filtered it through something distinctly American, distinctly Western, distinctly Colorado. The result was something that had never existed before. Their production company, which they founded with a couple of other students, was called Avenging Conscience, named after a D.W. Griffith silent film, one that both Parker and Stone actively disliked. That detail is almost too perfect. Their entire creative philosophy in miniature names something after the thing you don't respect. Take it somewhere unexpected. Parker had already established the visual style that would define South Park on an earlier student short called American History. Cut-out construction paper characters, rudimentary stop motion, the kind of animation that looks like a 5-year-old made it because, effectively, a college student essentially did. This style was not a budget limitation pretending to be a stylistic choice. Well, it was a budget limitation, but it also became genuinely central to what the show would be. In December of 1992, also near the end of the fall semester, Parker decided to make a Christmas short for the student film screening. He and Stone and a couple of classmates cut paper shapes, arranged them under a camera, and produced a 4-minute film called The Spirit of Christmas. In this one, 4 boys in Colorado accidentally bring a snowman to life. The snowman turns demonic and violent. The boys call on Jesus for help. There is profanity, there is blood, there is a moral to the story delivered by an 8-year-old voice. This first film is now called Jesus vs. Frosty to distinguish it from its more famous follow-up. It's fascinating to watch if you can find it because all the ingredients are there. The 4 boys are not yet named, and there's a quirky detail in how the characters are mapped. The fat kid in that first film is named Kenny, and the hooded kid who barely speaks and meets a violent end is unnamed. It took one more version of the story before the characters locked into their final forms. But here's something remarkable about that first film. Parker and Stone apparently forgot to include a credits sequence. They didn't put their names on it. So when the short began circulating among friends and eventually made its way around campus, people would show it to other people who would show it to Parker and Stone, and they'd say, "Here, look at this hilarious thing someone made." And Parker and Stone would have to explain that they were the ones who made it. They created the thing and then had to discover it secondhand. That kind of accidental origin keeps echoing through South Park's history. The film screened at the December 1992 student film night, got some laughs, and then mostly disappeared. Parker and Stone moved on to other projects, including the feature-length student film Cannibal the Musical, which is exactly what it sounds like. A musical comedy about an actual historical case of cannibalism in 19th century Colorado. It became a cult classic much later, but at the time it was just a film school project. Then came the moment that changed everything. A Fox Broadcasting Company executive named Brian Graydon had somehow encountered the 1992 Christmas short and loved it. In 1995, he offered Parker and Stone $2,000 to make a new version of The Spirit of Christmas, a video Christmas card he could send to friends. They agreed. The budget for the actual production was reportedly around $750, but with Parker and Stone pocketing the remaining $1,250 from the commission. That is perhaps the most financially savvy production deal in television history. This new version, which would eventually be known as Jesus vs. Santa, is the one that matters. It was made in 1995 with a slightly larger budget and slightly more developed characters. The town is now explicitly named South Park. The four boys are named Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny for the first time. The fat kid is now Cartman, and Kenny is now the orange-hooded figure whose dialogue you can barely understand. Kyle is established as Jewish. Cartman's anti-Semitism appears. The animation style closely mirrors what South Park would look like on television 2 years later. The plot this time involves the boys watching a street fight break out between Jesus and Santa Claus, each one arguing about the true meaning of Christmas while beating each other senseless. The boys swear throughout. Kenny is killed. There is a lesson at the end about how Christmas is really about presents, and that is good. It is 5 minutes long and was made for roughly the cost of a used car. Graydon sent the short on VHS tapes to about 80 friends in Hollywood in December 1995. One of those friends was reportedly George Clooney, who liked it so much he reportedly made hundreds of copies and continued spreading it around. Someone digitized it and posted it to the early internet, back when the internet was still a novelty for most people. Back when waiting 45 minutes for a file to download was considered acceptable behavior. But the short became one of the very first viral videos in internet history. People were huddling around office computers in Hollywood studios and advertising agencies and production companies, waiting for this grainy, crude little 5-minute cartoon to finish loading, and then turning to whoever was nearby and saying, "You have to see this." By early 1996, the thing had taken on a life entirely its own. VHS copies were being passed around Hollywood like underground contraband. The internet version was being shared and reshared before social media existed, before YouTube existed, before the concept of something going viral even had a name. This little construction paper Christmas card that Parker and Stone had been paid $2,000 to make was somehow everywhere, and Parker and Stone had no idea. They were not orchestrating this. There was no marketing campaign, no studio behind them, no publicist working the phones. The thing just spread because people couldn't stop showing it to other people, which is a deeply fitting origin for a show that would spend the next 3 decades making people feel compelled to talk about it. Comedy Central executive Doug Herzog watched the short and commissioned Parker and Stone to develop it into a television series. The meetings began. The pilots were planned. And here's a small detail that tells you a lot about what South Park was destined to become. Before the show had even begun production, the very first focus group that watched the pilot reportedly hated it so strongly that their recommendation was to throw the entire thing out and start over. But Comedy Central's president of programming, Eileen Katz, believed in it anyway. But she overruled the focus group. That decision would eventually turn Comedy Central from a barely watched niche cable channel into one of the most culturally significant networks in American television history. Fox had also been approached. Parker and Stone pitched the concept there first. Fox passed. Their stated reason was that they didn't want to air a show that featured a talking piece of feces as a character, specifically referencing what would become Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh, a recurring character in the South Park universe. Fox passed on South Park because of a cartoon poop joke, and they have been explaining that decision ever since. The technical process of building the actual pilot episode from construction paper was, by all accounts, a tedious nightmare. Graydon himself was involved in early meetings and remembered the process clearly. Every time the network had a note, Parker and Stone had to physically cut more paper shapes and reanimate sections of the episode by hand. This could take 5 days just to address a single note. Graydon later described an entire summer of Parker and Stone just sitting in a dark room cutting paper, just the two of them, animating responses to network feedback. After that first episode, they moved to computer software designed to mimic the construction paper cutout look. The show has not been made with actual paper since the pilot, but the handmade aesthetic stuck and became central to the show's identity in ways nobody fully predicted. On August 13th, 1997, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe aired for the first time at 10 in the evening on Comedy Central. And the title is exactly what it sounds like. It is the first episode of South Park. It pulled a Nielsen rating of 1.3, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For a cable network in 1997, that was considered a remarkable debut. The show had arrived, and the thing that would define every moment of its existence from that point forward, the controversy, the reaction, the noise, the outrage, and the adoration and everything in between, all of it started immediately, as if it had been waiting. There's one more piece of the origin story that deserves its own quiet moment. After Graydon's friends received the video Christmas card, copies began multiplying through Hollywood in a way that had no precedent and no name yet. The technology that made this possible was genuinely primitive. The internet existed, but only barely for most people. Downloading a video file of any significant size in 1995 or early 1996 required the kind of patience that most people today cannot imagine. You would start a download and then go make dinner and come back and it would still be going. You might leave it overnight. The video quality, when it finally arrived, was grainy and compressed to a fraction of what the original film actually looked like. None of that mattered. People waited for it anyway, and then they watched it, and then they found whoever was nearest and made them watch it too. The spirit of Christmas was shared across early internet listservs, through America Online message boards, through email chains at companies and universities, passed along in ways that the people doing the passing would have had no framework to describe. Now, they were just showing something funny to someone else. They had no idea they were creating the vocabulary for how all entertainment would eventually be distributed and consumed. Meanwhile, on the physical side of things, VHS cassette copies were being duplicated and passed hand to hand across Hollywood. Industry executives showed it at parties. Assistants made copies for their friends. The tape showed up in entertainment law offices and talent agencies and network development departments. It was underground contraband, which is a phrase Parker and Stone themselves have used to describe it, something that spread without authorization, without marketing, purely through the mechanism of one person deciding another person needed to see it. George Clooney, who was one of the recipients of Graydon's original distribution, but reportedly made hundreds of copies and continued distributing them himself. The figure Brian Boitano, the Olympic figure skater who was later immortalized in a South Park song, somehow received a copy as well and was reportedly flattered by how he was depicted. Word of the video's existence reached Comedy Central, and from there the conversation about turning it into a series began. There are very few documented cases in entertainment history where a creative work went from making zero to network series entirely through this kind of organic viral spread. Most shows start with a pitch. They have a development process: notes, rewrites, pilots, focus groups. South Park started because a Fox executive liked what two broke college students had made with scissors and glue, gave them $2,000 to make a new version, and that new version then circulated until a network paid attention. There was no grand strategy, there was no team. There were just Parker and Stone, two people making each other laugh, and then everyone else making copies. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment below and let me know where you are and what time it is. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a really good time. It helps more than you might think, and there's a lot more of this story still to tell. Section 2, the show that broke television. The show's early merchandising story has a quality to it that feels like accidental satire of American commercial culture. The characters appeared on everything imaginable in 1997 and 1998. T-shirts, backpacks, hats, plush toys, keychains, pencil cases, notebooks, hot lunch boxes. The characters who were being condemned by parent groups for corrupting children were simultaneously available in children's retail spaces everywhere. A parent could buy their child a Cartman backpack and a PTC newsletter, condemning Cartman's influence on children in the same cultural moment. The cognitive dissonance was enormous and apparently quite profitable. The show's first season also began establishing something that would define its creative identity forever after: the ability to hold contradictory tones simultaneously. The same show could in one week produce a genuinely heartfelt episode about sexuality and belonging, and the following week produce something involving graphic bodily humor with no redeeming social intent whatsoever. Kenny McCormick died in almost every single episode of the first 5 seasons of the show. Not just death in the cartoon sense of things that happens to characters. Kenny died in creatively violent ways and then returned the following episode without explanation. He was killed by being crushed, electrocuted, devoured, shot, burned, and subjected to things that defy easy categorization. The joke accumulated across the entire run of those 5 seasons, with Stan and Kyle acknowledging each death with the same 2 lines, until the show decided to actually kill the character off permanently in Season 6 and see what happened. The decision to permanently kill Kenny in the Season 6 episode, appropriately titled Kenny Dies, generated its own kind of reaction, mostly confusion. Parker and Stone had grown tired of the running gag, and feeling it had become predictable rather than funny. They killed the character, announced they would not bring him back, and then brought him back anyway about a year later. By then, the absence had been felt, and the return was welcome. It was a small demonstration of the show's relationship with its own mythology, willing to break anything if there was a reason to, and willing to rebuild it if the breaking didn't produce the expected result. The character of Cartman deserves extended consideration, because he is genuinely one of the most complex and carefully constructed antagonists in animated television history. And that claim is not a reach. Eric Cartman is a child defined by specific and escalating moral failures. He is racist, anti-Semitic, manipulative, and profoundly selfish. He will destroy relationships, ruin lives, and in the episode Scott Tenorman must die engineer actual deaths and serve someone's parents to them as food, in service of personal vendettas. And yet the show has maintained this character for over 2 decades, explored his psychology across hundreds of episodes, and in doing so has created one of the most sustained and specific portraits of a particular kind of American pathology that any fictional medium has attempted. There is a reading of Cartman that sees him not as a villain, but as a diagnostic tool. The show puts its most objectionable sentiments in his mouth and then examines what those sentiments produce. Cartman's racism and anti-Semitism are always shown to be the moral and practical failures of someone whose worldview is fundamentally broken. He does not succeed because he is racist. He occasionally appears to succeed in the short term through manipulation, but the show consistently brings consequences to bear on his character in ways that are deeply satisfying to the audience. He is not a portrait of evil that glamorizes evil. He is a portrait of evil that makes evil look exactly as foolish and sad and ultimately unsuccessful as it is. The 1999 poll in the United Kingdom in which children voted Cartman. Their favorite personality is one of the most interesting footnotes in the show's history. Not because children voted for a racist cartoon character, but because the fact that children voted for him reveals something genuine about how the character works. Cartman is funny. He is creative in a horrible way. He has an energy and a commitment to his plans that reads as charismatic, even when those plans are monstrous. But children respond to that energy without necessarily having the developed moral framework to contextualize what the show is saying about that energy. Adults watching the same character see the full picture. The ambiguity in the response to Cartman is not a flaw in the show's design. It is the design. Kenny's muffled dialogue is one of the show's most persistent technical jokes. Matt Stone, who voices Kenny, records the character's lines by speaking directly into his own sleeve or hand, creating the characteristic muffled sound in which the words are technically audible if you know what they are, but effectively incomprehensible if you don't. In certain episodes, Kenny's muffled dialogue contains material far more adult than the surrounding conversation. Fans of the show have spent decades decoding the muffled lines and sharing the results, creating an entire secondary community around understanding what Kenny is actually saying at any given moment. The joke requires the audience to do work, which makes the reward feel earned. The show also began very early to establish a tradition of hiding alien figures in individual episodes. In what became known as the Visitor Easter eggs, a specific alien character began appearing in the background of episodes, sometimes barely visible, sometimes quite prominent. These Easter eggs became a kind of Where's Waldo game for dedicated viewers, creating an additional layer of engagement for the audience that had nothing to do with the episode's content and everything to do with Parker and Stone rewarding people who were paying close attention. To understand what South Park did to the television landscape, you have to understand what that landscape looked like in 1997. The Simpsons had been on the air for 8 years. It was the most boundary-pushing animated show on American television by a considerable margin. Its Bart had said some mildly subversive things, its writers had pushed back against Reagan-era conservatism, and the Parents Television Council had clucked disapprovingly about it on multiple occasions. It was rated TV PG. Its most extreme transgression was a prank phone call to a bar. Beavis and Butthead had existed on MTV for a few years. That was edgier, more deliberately provocative, but it looked and felt like something made for teenagers, by teenagers, and the audience processed it that way. There was nothing, literally nothing, on American television in 1997 that prepared anyone for what South Park was about to do. A critic from Variety named Ray Richmond reviewed the show in August 1997 and wrote that South Park was, in his assessment, the show that would bring down the Republic, the one that God himself warned about. He called it Peanuts meets A Clockwork Orange. That phrase is one of the most accurate descriptions of any television show ever written. The innocence of children's animation laid over the top of content that was genuinely transgressive in both its humor and its ideas. That cognitive gap between the crayon drawing aesthetic and what was actually being said was the engine of the show's power, and also the engine of its controversy. The early ratings growth was extraordinary. By the time the season 1 episode Damien aired, the show's Nielsen rating had climbed to 6.4. This was a cable show that had started below 1, at reaching a 6.4 in a single season. Comedy Central's subscriber household count went from 9.1 million in 1997 to 50 million odd by June of 1998. 50 million. The network grew by more than 500% in roughly 1 year, and it did so largely on the back of 4 construction paper children in Colorado. The reaction from parents' groups was immediate. The Parents Television Council, which would become a recurring antagonist in the South Park story, called the show so offensive it should never have been made. Schools began banning South Park t-shirts. A group of principals in New Jersey launched a campaign warning parents about the show's content. Hickory Flat Elementary in Georgia issued an outright ban on any clothing featuring South Park characters. These were elementary school administrators dedicating their professional attention to a cartoon that, in the same sentence, had been nominated for a GLAAD Award for its compassionate portrayal of a gay character in the episode Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride. That GLAAD nomination is a detail that tends to get lost. It aired on September 3, 1997, less than a month into the show's existence. In it, Stan's dog Sparky discovers he is gay and runs away to live with Big Gay Al, a cheerful, kind-hearted man who runs a sanctuary for gay animals and teaches the boys that being gay is natural and beautiful. It was one of the most sympathetic and positive portrayals of a gay character on American television at the time. At the same time the PTC was calling for the show to be canceled, the GLAAD organization was nominating it for an award. Both of those things were true simultaneously. South Park was already operating in contradictions. In 1999, a poll conducted by a British bank called NatWest asked 8- and 9-year-old children in the United Kingdom who their favorite personality was. Not favorite cartoon character, favorite personality. Above all the living, breathing humans they had access to for a vote, 8- and 9-year-olds chose Eric Cartman, a cartoon child defined by racism, anti-Semitism, manipulation, and extreme cruelty. The headmaster of a Cambridge school publicly urged parents to stop letting their children watch. Parent councils in England were publicly alarmed, and Parker and Stone had to sit with the knowledge that they had created a character so magnificently deplorable that children instinctively loved him. The animation itself deserves more attention in this story. The pilot episode was made with real construction paper, as mentioned. Everything after that was done using computer software designed to replicate the look of paper cutouts. But the software they used was not designed for professional animation. Parker and Stone used software called Power Animator at first, then later transitioned to other tools including Autodesk Maya. The crude look of the characters, the flat colors, the limited movement, the way limbs move in jerky increments rather than fluidly, all of that is deliberate. The animation looks the way it looks because Parker and Stone wanted it to look that way. Parker has explained this clearly in interviews. He has said the crude animation is part of the comedy. If South Park were made with Pixar-level fluidity and beauty, the jokes would not be funny. They would be disturbing. The paper cutout style creates a buffer of unreality, a visual permission slip that lets the audience laugh at things that would be horrifying if they looked photorealistic. When Kenny is killed in some gruesome way, it's funny partly because he looks like a flat orange envelope with eyes. The medium is inseparable from the message. The show's first season also contained a detail about self-censorship that rarely gets discussed. The fifth episode, An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig, which aired on September 10, 1997, originally contained a scene in which Stan's sister Shelley repeatedly set Stan on fire and then extinguished him to prevent him from dying, only to set him on fire again. This was part of a subplot about Shelley's habit of physically abusing her younger brother. Comedy Central pulled the scene after its initial broadcast, specifically because they were worried about the same kind of blowback they had received over similar content on Beavis and Butthead. On the DVD releases of the episode, you can still see a faint pool of water on the floor beneath Stan, a ghost of the deleted scene. On the Blu-ray release, even that subtle trace was removed. The show was being censored before most people had heard of it. The sixth episode, appropriately called Death, introduced Terrence and Phillip, the fictional cartoon that the South Park children watch on television. And the parents in South Park are horrified by the vulgarity and moral bankruptcy of this cartoon. The joke is transparent to any adult watching. The parents' reaction to Terrence and Phillip mirrors exactly how real-world parents were reacting to South Park itself. The show was commenting on its own controversy before it was 2 months old. That level of self-awareness, that willingness to examine its own cultural position from inside the work, is unusual for any show. For a show that was 7 episodes in, it was remarkable. Parker and Stone also recorded audio commentary tracks for every episode of the first season, intending them for DVD release. Comedy Central refused to include them because the commentary contained content that violated the network's standards. Parker and Stone refused to have the commentary edited or censored. The result was that the commentary tracks were eventually released on a separate compact disc, sold independently of the DVDs. Even the behind-the-scenes material about the show was too controversial for the network that aired the show. That is the kind of detail that says something essential about the relationship between these creators and their home network, a relationship defined equally by creative partnership and creative friction that would persist for decades. And then there were the merchandise complications. By late 1997 and into 1998, South Park merchandise was appearing everywhere. T-shirts, hats, toys, all the standard commercial apparatus. Paramount's licensing division expanded distribution to major retailers including Target and JCPenney. But JCPenney ended its South Park merchandise relationship in April 1999 following customer complaints. Fast food chains wanted nothing to do with the show's content. The situation was almost paradoxical. South Park was one of the most commercially successful entertainment properties in America, and simultaneously, essentially, unmarketable through traditional brand partnerships. The content that made it a hit was the exact content that made every major brand treat it like radioactive material. The show's first real interaction with real-world tragedy came on April 20th, 1999, when the Columbine High School shooting happened in Littleton, Colorado. Matt Stone graduated from Heritage High School in Littleton, which is in the same school district as Columbine. Both Parker and Stone were deeply affected by what happened in their home community. In the aftermath of Columbine, South Park, a show that had been on the air for less than 2 years and was already one of the most criticized programs in America, suddenly existed in a completely different cultural context. The show had always been accused of corrupting young people. Now, in the wake of an atrocity carried out by teenagers, that accusation carried weight it hadn't before. The South Park movie, which had been written before Columbine and came out just 2 months after the shooting, was already a story about how blaming entertainment for societal violence is misguided. It argued against exactly the kind of scapegoating that millions of people were doing in the wake of April 20th. Parker and Stone have said they genuinely worried the film would seem insensitive or blindly tone-deaf. They also felt that changing or pulling the film would be the exact kind of knee-jerk censorship the movie was arguing against. They released it anyway. It was, in retrospect, the correct call. Section 3. The greatest prank in television history. April 1st, 1998. The date matters here. Hold it in your mind as we go through this. The first season of South Park had ended on a cliffhanger. The finale was an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, the name of which is itself a piece of the South Park story. And the central question of the episode was simple. Who is Eric Cartman's father? The episode ended without answering the question, which in 1997 was not standard procedure. Audiences were accustomed to watching cable television that either answered its questions or didn't pose them. A genuine cliffhanger on a comedy cartoon was unusual enough to generate real buzz. Fans were told to tune in to the Season 2 premiere to find out. This was not a small audience. By early 1998, South Park was a cultural phenomenon. The number of households with Comedy Central had gone from 9.1 million to 50 million in roughly 1 year. This show was the engine driving that growth. People who had never heard of Comedy Central were now subscribing to cable packages specifically to watch 4 construction paper boys in Colorado. The mystery of Cartman's father was being discussed in offices and schools and bars across America. The Season 2 premiere was one of the most anticipated episodes in cable television history up to that point. The Season 2 premiere aired on April 1st, 1998. April Fool's Day. The episode begins normally enough. There's a recap of the first season finale's cliffhanger. The tension builds. The sense of imminent revelation is carefully constructed. And then a title card appears. Not a South Park episode. And instead, Not Without My Anus, starring Terrence and Phillip. Happy April Fool's Day. What followed was 22 minutes of fart jokes. Not Stan, not Kyle, not Cartman, not Kenny, not even the slightest reference to the mystery of Cartman's father. Just Terrence and Phillip, the flatulent Canadian comedy duo from the show within the show, dealing with Saddam Hussein trying to take over Canada through elaborate bathroom humor. Comedy Central received more than 2,000 angry emails within 1 week of broadcast. Their phone lines were flooded. Viewers who had waited 4 weeks for the reveal of Cartman's father instead received what one contemporary online commenter called a big expletive U to all South Park fans. Some people abandoned the show entirely and never came back. A Newsday critic Diane Wirtz wrote that fans had essentially rioted. Matt Stone's response, delivered in Entertainment Weekly, was characteristically measured. If you get that upset because you don't know who a construction paper kid's father is, there is really something wrong with you. There are a few details about this prank that make it even more extraordinary in retrospect. The episode itself, which Parker and Stone have called their favorite episode they ever made, is a perfectly constructed piece of absurdism. Saddam Hussein is the villain. Celine Dion is a character. The plotline follows Terrence and Phillip attempting to save Canada from invasion while performing fart-based legal arguments in a courtroom. The credits include positions like fart wrangler and fart coach. Now, there are actual in-jokes embedded throughout for the observant viewer, including a moment where Terrence and Phillip watch South Park on their own television and dismiss it as lame. The show nested inside itself to mock the people angry at the nesting. The episode does not air in syndication. It is difficult to find legally because it represents such a strange pocket of television history, a contractual obligation that became a legendary piece of performance art. What's also worth noting is that Parker and Stone apparently added something deliberate to the fake credits. They included the announcement that the answer to the Cartman's father mystery would be revealed in a few weeks. which meant fans who had been tricked had to keep watching. And they did. The actual resolution, an episode called Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, aired 3 weeks later on April 22nd, 1998, and pulled a rating of 8.2, 6.2 million viewers. It was the highest-rated non-sports broadcast on basic cable in American television history at that point. During the spring of 1998, 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on all of basic cable television were South Park episodes. The prank had, perversely, driven ratings even higher than a straightforward premiere would have. Parker and Stone learned something fundamental about their audience and about themselves through this experiment. The audience did not just want to be entertained. They wanted to be surprised. They wanted to be challenged. They were even willing to be genuinely infuriated if the payoff eventually warranted it. This understanding that provocation and reward are more interesting than comfort and predictability, I would define the creative philosophy behind the show for everything that came after. There is also a production detail from the second season that tends to get overlooked. Parker and Stone have spoken about how the first couple of seasons were not their best work and represent a period they're not especially proud of. Stone has said the second season in particular is their least favorite. This is partly because the pressure of the show's sudden, enormous success was difficult to manage creatively. They were writing a phenomenon, not a show, and that changes how you think about what you're making. The April Fool's episode exists partly in the context of two creators who were already feeling the weight of what they'd built and were deliberately testing whether they could break the machine they'd created. Thus, the level of cultural anticipation around the season to premiere in 1998 is difficult to fully convey because the infrastructure for that kind of collective cultural weighting has changed so thoroughly. There was no social media to track fan speculation in real time. There were no forum threads with thousands of replies accumulating theories over weeks, though there were early internet message boards and listservs where dedicated fans congregated. The mystery of who Cartman's father was had to be carried in people's heads between episodes, discussed in person, in school hallways and offices and bars, without anywhere to exhaust the speculation. When the answer finally arrived, it had to be worth everything the audience had put into waiting for it. The fake episode's credits are themselves a micro-comedy. On the list of crew positions includes fart wrangler, fart coach, fart coordinator, fart layout, digital fart artist, and flatulence designer. This suggests that Parker and Stone spent time on the joke at a level of detail that the casual viewer would never notice. They were not just pulling a prank. They were constructing a complete artifact of prank television, something that held together completely on its own terms, while being deliberately infuriating in the context in which it was delivered. Comedy Central even ran a promotional spot using recordings of the actual angry voicemail messages viewers left about the episode. This was either inspired self-awareness, using the audience's rage as entertainment material, or a remarkable absence of sympathy for their viewers, or possibly both in equal measure. And the line between those two things on this show has always been difficult to locate precisely. Section 4. The movie that went to war with a ratings board. Development on the South Park movie began during the first season, around January of 1998. Parker and Stone signed a deal with Comedy Central that covered both continuing episodes and a feature film. They had conditions. One of those conditions was non-negotiable. The movie had to receive at least an R rating. They were not interested in making a movie with the creative restrictions of a PG-13. Paramount Pictures, which was handling distribution, initially asked if they'd consider a PG-13 to maximize the film's commercial potential. Parker and Stone immediately declined. Stone told Entertainment Weekly their intention was to create the vilest film they could ever make. While what followed was one of the stranger battles in Hollywood history. The film, which would eventually be titled South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America for rating 6 times. 6 times. Each of the first 5 submissions came back with an NC-17 rating, which is effectively a commercial death sentence for a mainstream theatrical release. Theaters won't book NC-17 films. Advertisers won't touch them. Retailers won't stock them. An NC-17 on a major studio release is the film industry's equivalent of a quarantine. Here's the detail that makes this story perfect. At some point during the back and forth with the MPAA, The ratings board gave Parker and Stone specific guidance. If the film exceeded 400 swear words, it would receive an automatic NC-17. The film was resubmitted with exactly 399 profanities, one fewer than the threshold. 399. That number is not an accident. That is someone counting very carefully. The film received an R rating on its sixth submission, not because of any cuts, not because of any compromises. The final film that reached theaters was essentially the same film that had been receiving NC-17 ratings, with one fewer profanity than the magic number. The MPAA had to give it an R, and MPAA President Jack Valenti later said publicly that he regretted not assigning it an NC-17. In response to the controversy, the MPAA actually expanded its rating system in 2000 to include detailed written descriptions alongside letter ratings, a practice that continues today. The Guinness World Records organization took notice. In their 2001 edition, they awarded the film the record for most swearing in an animated film, citing 399 profanities, including 146 uses of a specific word that we'll leave to the imagination here, along with 128 offensive gestures and 221 acts of violence. One act of something offensive or violent approximately every 6 seconds of screen time. The film is also a genuinely accomplished musical. Not a cartoon with some songs, but a real Broadway-caliber musical with proper dramatic structure and thematic coherence. Parker, who had studied music and has considerable compositional ability, wrote most of the songs himself. The song Blame Canada was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song, which meant that Robin Williams had to perform a cleaned-up version of a song originally titled to include something quite different at the Academy Awards ceremony in a tuxedo, in front of a politely applauding audience that included the very celebrities the film had been mocking. That is either the most surreal moment in Oscar history or very close to it. The film's musical structure is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is genuinely sophisticated in ways that tend to get overshadowed by the controversy attached to it. The songs follow the classic Broadway arc of establishing characters and their desires, complicating those desires, and resolving them through action. Kyle's solo about wanting to be a good person. Stan's love song to Wendy that derails into absurdism. Satan's genuinely affecting power ballad about wanting a love that is real and not manipulative. The last one, performed by a giant animated devil, contains more genuine emotional truth about toxic relationships than many serious films manage. The medium creates distance, and the distance allows the content to land. Parker and Stone have talked about the film's production with a kind of nostalgic pride mixed with acknowledgement of how strange the whole process was. They were fighting the MPAA one submission at a time, adding offensive material each time the film was returned with an NC-17 to see if they could find the precise boundary between the two ratings. Stone later described each resubmission as an experiment. This time they added something more extreme than the last version to test whether the MPAA even had consistent standards, or whether the process was entirely arbitrary. The process, he said, confirmed that the ratings board was operating without coherent principles. There is a detail about the film's title that captures the spirit of the whole enterprise perfectly. The film was originally going to be called South Park, All Hell Breaks Loose. Parker and Stone have said the MPAA objected to the word hell in the title, though the MPAA has denied this characterization. The replacement title, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, is a double meaning that would be obvious to any adult reading it. The MPAA approved the replacement title. They rejected a word used in common speech to describe a destination in religious belief, but approved a title that is a subtle but unmistakable anatomical joke. Well, Parker pointed this out at the time as a perfect illustration of the incoherence of American censorship standards. The film itself argues exactly this point, and then the MPAA demonstrated it by approving the title. On the subject of the Academy Awards, Parker and Stone attended the ceremony in 2000 to represent their film. They arrived on the red carpet wearing dresses. Stone wore a lavender gown modeled after the dress Jennifer Lopez had worn to the Grammy Awards earlier that year. Parker wore a pink dress inspired by the one Gwyneth Paltrow had worn when she won her Oscar the previous year. Both creators have admitted they had taken LSD before the ceremony. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences let them in anyway, because of course they did. The film that required 6 MPA submissions had earned its place at the most prestigious night in Hollywood by the simple mechanism of making enough money and generating enough cultural conversation that everyone had to acknowledge it. The film's plot is a direct commentary on American censorship hypocrisy. The boys sneak into a rated R Canadian comedy film, start swearing as a result, their parents launch a moral panic, and the United States declares war on Canada. The film being a satire of the very process it went through to reach audiences, arguing that violence is culturally acceptable while language is taboo, is evident in the MPAA's own behavior throughout production. The ratings board objected to words throughout the submission process. They never once raised concerns about the scenes depicting soldiers being shot to death. Parker pointed this out in interviews. They had a problem with words, not bullets. The film also contains a subplot involving Saddam Hussein as Satan's manipulative and abusive boyfriend in hell. This is important for later in the story. When the real Saddam Hussein was on trial for genocide in 2006, Matt Stone joked in an interview that the United States military had been repeatedly showing him the film as a form of psychological torment during his incarceration. There has never been any official confirmation of this story, but the fact that it is entirely possible that a construction paper film depicting a dictator as a cartoon villain in hell might have been used as an instrument of state pressure says something about the strange position South Park occupies in the larger world. Section 5. The 6-Day Machine. At some point in the show's run, a production decision was made that transformed South Park from an animated television series into something unprecedented in scripted entertainment. Starting with the 4th season, which began airing in April of 2000, each episode was written, voice-acted, animated, and delivered to Comedy Central in approximately 6 days. 6 days from blank page to finished broadcast episode. To understand why this is remarkable, consider what the normal production timeline for an animated series looks like. The Simpsons, which remains a reasonable comparison, takes approximately 6 to 9 months to produce a single episode. Family Guy operates on similar schedules. The process involves writing, rewriting, table reads, more rewriting, voice recording, animatic creation, a full animation, post-production, and delivery, all spread across a carefully managed multi-month pipeline. There are teams of writers and rooms full of animators and schedules planned a year or more in advance. South Park does all of that in 6 days. The documentary film 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford and broadcast on Comedy Central on October 9, 2011, follows the creation of the season. 15 premiere human centipede across one production week. Watching it is a somewhat alarming experience. Parker pacing the writer's room at 2 in the morning, the animation team beginning work on scenes while the script is still being finished, voice recording sessions happening while earlier scenes are still being animated. The completed episode being transmitted to Comedy Central's New York headquarters with hours to spare before broadcast. The 6-day schedule begins on a Thursday, typically. Parker and Stone and their small writing staff gather to discuss what's happening in the world, what's annoying them, what's funny, what's absurd. They spend much of Thursday and Friday trying to find the episode. Not writing it, finding it, locating the kernel of the idea that can become a 22-minute story. This is described by participants as the most anxiety-inducing part of the process because there's no guarantee the idea will come. Parker has described the terror of staring at a blank page on Thursday, knowing that by Wednesday of the following week, the finished product needs to be on the air. Once the idea is found, the script writing happens in something close to real time. The voice recording follows immediately. Parker voices Cartman, Stan, Randy Marsh, and numerous other characters. Stone voices Kyle and Kenny, among others. Kenny's dialogue, by the way, is recorded by Stone talking directly into his hand or sleeve to create the characteristic muffled sound. The voice acting sessions are often barely contained chaos, with Parker and Stone cracking each other up between takes, the sound engineers quietly suffering through the unscheduled laughter. Animation begins as recording happens. The show uses Autodesk Maya, a three-dimensional modeling program, to create the flat, two-dimensional look. Each character is built from flat image planes manipulated in a 3D space, which is why the show can be produced so quickly compared to traditional animation. But the computer can move and reposition pieces much faster than any human animator working with physical materials. The style that looks handmade is produced through software that enables industrial-scale production. The end of the week is when things get genuinely urgent. Parker has described nights when the question is not whether it will be a 5 in the morning night, but whether it will be a 9 or 10 in the morning night. The crew pulls through the night, completing the final scenes, locking the audio, finalizing the edit. The completed episode is then carried physically to a satellite uplink facility near the studio by longtime producer Frank Agnoni, who uploads it to Comedy Central's network for broadcast. This sometimes happens with hours to spare, sometimes considerably fewer. The 6-day schedule means South Park can respond to current events faster than any other scripted show on television. An example. In Season 4, an episode called Quintuplets 2000 referenced the United States government's raid of a house during the Elian Gonzalez immigration case, a specific event that had happened only 4 days before the episode aired. 4 days. In Season 9, the episode Best Friends Forever, which referenced the Terry Schiavo right-to-die case, aired in the middle of the real-world controversy and less than 12 hours before Schiavo herself died. The show was responding to events as they happened, with a production speed that no other scripted television could match. This speed has consequences. When you write and produce something in 6 days, you don't have the luxury of extensive reflection. You don't run drafts through sensitivity readers or run through how a joke might land across different demographics at different points in time. You have 6 days from idea to broadcast, and most of those 6 days are spent just getting the episode finished. This is why Parker has said in interviews that the fear of not being funny is always more present than the fear of being offensive. When you watch the documentary, you can see the creative anxiety is about whether the episode will be good, not about whether it will upset someone. The controversy is a byproduct of creative urgency, not a goal in itself. There is something almost meditative about watching the 6 days to air documentary, particularly late at night. The show's creators and production staff working through the night, building something out of nothing in real time, and the countdown clock ticking in the corner of the screen, the casual California darkness outside the studio windows. Something about watching creative people under pressure in the quiet hours of a working night has a particular quality of intimacy, like overhearing someone thinking. The animation software used for South Park is more sophisticated than the show's aesthetic suggests. Autodesk Maya is a professional three-dimensional modeling and animation platform used for visual effects in major Hollywood films. South Park uses it to produce images that deliberately look primitive. The characters are flat cutouts rendered in a three-dimensional space, moved in ways that replicate the limited articulation of paper shapes. The arms do not bend fluidly. The mouths are simple shapes. The movement is jerky rather than smooth. All of this is chosen, not accidental. The technical infrastructure behind the crude aesthetic is actually quite powerful. The show employs a relatively small permanent staff compared to other animated series of comparable length. Parker and Stone themselves voice the majority of the main characters. Parker handles Stan, Cartman, Randy Marsh, Mr. Garrison, and many others. Stone handles Kel, Kenny, and a range of secondary characters. The voice sessions are often two people in a recording booth talking to each other and to themselves, doing multiple characters in conversation, the audio equivalent of a person doing all the voices in a book they're reading aloud. The documentary captures moments where both of them are clearly barely containing laughter at lines they're delivering. The sound engineers doing their best to edit out the background amusement. One specific example from the documentary, the script for Human Centipede originated from a moment in the writer's room where Parker offhandedly mentioned his frustration with having to click through terms and conditions to download the latest version of iTunes without reading what he was agreeing to. This casual complaint became the entire premise of the episode, in which Kyle similarly agrees to Apple's terms and conditions without reading them and discovers the agreement included consenting to a horrifying biological procedure. The journey from Parker's personal annoyance at a software update to a finished broadcast episode took 6 days. The production team also includes a standards and practices review process that runs parallel to the creative work. Which producer Anne Garefano is responsible for navigating Comedy Central's content policies, presenting the initial concepts to network lawyers and standards reviewers while the episode is still being built. The documentary captures her making phone calls to describe episodes in progress to network representatives in a tone of calm professional matter-of-factness that is genuinely impressive given the content she is describing. This process happens in real time, with the episode being made on one side of a building while its content is reviewed on the other side of a phone call, and any adjustments being folded back into the ongoing production without stopping the clock. The Tiger Woods golf video game incident deserves its own moment in this section because it is one of the stranger footnotes in the show's history. In 1998, out of the PlayStation game Tiger Woods 99 was released, rated E for everyone by the Entertainment Software Rating Board. Someone at Electronic Arts, the publisher, who was apparently a South Park fan, secretly embedded the 1995 Spirit of Christmas short inside the game's data. The file was labeled in a way that obscured its content and was accessible by players who put the game disc into a personal computer rather than a game console, where it would appear as a data disk with readable files. When parents discovered that a game they had purchased for their children to play, rated E for everyone, contained a 5-minute short featuring Jesus and Santa Claus beating each other up while children screamed profanities, the response was significant. Electronic Arts recalled the game in January of 1999. South Park had managed to smuggle itself into people's homes through a children's game about golf. The show has, in its history, literally been hidden inside other products, spreading without authorization into places it was never supposed to be. That has a poetic quality to it, considered from a sufficient distance. Section 6, Scientology, Tom Cruise, and the saddest story in South Park history. On November 16, 2005, South Park aired the episode that would generate the biggest sustained institutional response the show had ever faced. The episode was called Trapped in the Closet, and it was Season 9, Episode 12. The plot is deceptively simple. Stan Marsh takes a Scientology personality test and is told he has unusually high levels of a spiritual substance called thetans. He is declared to be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. Tom Cruise arrives at his house to pay respects, is told by Stan that his movies are just okay and not that great, and then literally locks himself in Stan's closet and refuses to come out. John Travolta arrives and joins him. Other celebrities follow. Meanwhile, the actual beliefs of the Church of Scientology, including the story of Xenu, the galactic ruler, the volcanoes, the spacecraft, the spiritual trauma encoding, are laid out on screen, accompanied by a caption that reads, in plain text, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode was directed and co-written by Trey Parker, who is credited under the pseudonym John Smith. It is widely considered one of the show's best episodes and holds a 9.1 out of 10 rating on IMDb as of writing. Parker and Stone had been told by everyone in their industry that nobody went after Scientology. As Stone explained in a later podcast, every single person in Hollywood was terrified of the church because it was intensely litigious. The church sued critics. It sued journalists. It launched harassment campaigns against ex-members and detractors. Within Hollywood specifically, where the church had a significant membership among influential people, publicly criticizing Scientology was considered professionally dangerous. Stone's words were essentially, "Everybody was scared of Scientology. We just didn't care." The day after the episode aired, November 17, 2005, a high-ranking Scientology official named Mike Render wrote a memo to church leadership about how to respond to the episode. Now, this memo was later made public when Render left the church and became one of its most vocal critics. Then came the episode's scheduled rebroadcast, planned for March 15, 2006. Comedy Central pulled the episode at the last minute and replaced it with a rerun of an older episode. The official explanation was that it was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had announced his departure from the show 2 days earlier. Multiple media outlets reported that Tom Cruise had threatened to boycott the promotional tour for Mission Impossible 3, which was being distributed by Paramount, which is owned by Viacom, which also owns Comedy Central, unless the Scientology episode was removed from rotation. Cruise's representatives denied this. The timing was precisely what it was. Parker and Stone issued a public statement. But it was signed Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. Now we get to the part of this story that needs to be told carefully, because it involves a real person who loved what he did and never got to speak for himself. Isaac Hayes had been the voice of Chef since the very first episode in 1997. Chef, the school's cafeteria cook with the warm voice and the tendency to break into inexplicably sexual songs, was one of the most beloved characters on the show. Hayes was not just a voice actor, he was a legendary musician. He wrote and performed Hold On I'm Coming and Soul Man with writing partner David Porter for Stax Records. He wrote and performed the Oscar-winning theme to Shaft. He was a genuine artistic giant who had found, late in his career, a second chapter as a beloved animated character. He adored the work, and he adored the fans. In March of 2006, a press release was issued in Hayes' name stating that he was departing South Park. The statement cited the show's intolerance of religious beliefs and its bigotry as reasons for his departure. The word Scientology appeared nowhere in the statement, but the implication was clear given the timing. Stone was devastated by the departure. He was also honest about his observation that Hayes had never expressed objections to the show's mockery of Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, or any other belief system. He had happily voiced Chef through episodes that satirized all of those traditions. The only thing that changed was Scientology. Stone's response at the time was blunt. This is 100% about his faith of Scientology. What Stone did not know yet, and what would not become fully clear until 2016, was what had actually happened. In January of 2006, 2 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, Isaac Hayes suffered a severe stroke. The stroke left him unable to speak coherently, unable to make decisions on his own, unable to sign his name. Everyone around Hayes at the time, his assistants, his publicists, his managers, were members of the Church of Scientology. Someone within that circle, working without Hayes' ability to consent or understand what was happening, issued the resignation statement in his name. Hayes himself did not quit South Park. Someone quit South Park for him. His son, Isaac Hayes III, told The Hollywood Reporter in 2016, the year of the show's 20th anniversary. Isaac Hayes did not quit South Park. Scientology did. Stone has confirmed that this is what he and Parker came to believe happened. Think about the weight of that for a moment. A man who loved his role on a show, who loved the character he had helped build and voice for almost a decade, who genuinely enjoyed the creative community he was part of, had all of that taken from him by people who were supposed to be caring for him while he was at his most vulnerable. He never got to speak for himself. He never got to say goodbye to the character he'd created. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who had responded to what appeared to be a betrayal by doing what felt like the only appropriate thing in the moment, which was writing the character out of the show in as dramatic a fashion as possible, were never able to reconcile with Hayes before he died. Hayes passed away on August 10, 2008, but from a second stroke at age 65. He was found unresponsive at his home near Memphis, Tennessee. Parker and Stone dedicated the season 12 episode The China Problem, which aired the same year, to his memory. The Return of Chef, the episode written immediately after the press release, depicts the character as having been brainwashed by a fictional cult called the Super Adventure Club. It uses old recordings of Hayes' voice spliced and rearranged to create new dialogue. It ends with Chef dying in an extremely graphic way. Looking back at it now, knowing what actually happened, the episode reads differently than it did when it aired. It was a response written in confusion and hurt to what appeared to be a betrayal. And the truth turned out to be something much more complicated and much sadder. Section 7. The bravest cartoon on television. Before any of the threats arrived, before anything became dangerous, there was a South Park episode that aired without controversy in 2001 that would later become the center of the most serious crisis the show ever faced. July 4th, 2001. Season 5, Episode 3. The episode was called Super Best Friends, and its premise was this. The boys get involved with a David Blaine-type cult, and a group of religious superhero figures teams up to save the day. The team includes Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Lao Tzu, and Muhammad. Muhammad appears on screen. He has fire-based powers. He is depicted heroically, positively, sympathetically. He is treated with the same irreverence and the same respect as every other religious figure on the show. But he even appeared in the show's opening title sequence as part of the crowd of characters. Nobody cared. No outrage. No complaints. No threats. The episode aired, was watched by its audience, and life moved on. This is important because of what happened next. In September 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad. The response was global and, in several places, violent. Embassies were attacked. People were killed in protests in multiple countries. Cartoonists received credible death threats and went into hiding. The global media conversation was suddenly dominated by the question of whether depicting Muhammad in any visual form was acceptable, and the answer being provided by some people involved violence. By the time South Park began directly addressing this issue in 2006, the world had fundamentally changed from what it had been when Super Best Friends aired in 2001. 2 months after that episode, 9/11 had happened. Now there were Danish cartoon riots and international diplomatic incidents. The question of whether a cartoon show could depict a religious figure as a superhero with fire powers had acquired dimensions it did not have when the question was first answered. South Park first addressed the Muhammad issue head-on in the Season 10 two-parter Cartoon Wars, which aired on April 5th and 12th, 2006. The episodes involve Family Guy planning to air an episode in which Muhammad appears. Muslim extremists threaten violent retaliation. Cartman, who hates Family Guy for entirely selfish, petty reasons, unrelated to religion, attempts to get the episode canceled. Kyle fights to have it air uncensored. While the episode makes a careful, deliberate argument, depictions of Muhammad are not inherently offensive, and fear should not determine what can be shown on television. Then Comedy Central censored it. A scene in which Muhammad was supposed to appear was replaced by a black screen with text reading, "Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network." Parker and Stone had written an episode about a network censoring a cartoon depiction of Muhammad. The actual network then censored their actual cartoon's depiction of Muhammad. The fiction and the reality collapsed together in one of the most extraordinary moments of accidental artistic irony in television history. A replacement scene was also notable. The scene that was meant to show Muhammad handing a football helmet to Peter Griffin from Family Guy, as a completely neutral and positive depiction, was replaced with a scene showing Jesus defecating on President Bush and the American flag. Comedy Central allowed that without hesitation. You could show Jesus performing the most undignified act imaginable upon the President of the United States and the national symbol of America. You could not show a religious figure handing someone a football helmet. Parker and Stone pointed out this double standard explicitly and repeatedly. They were allowed to illustrate it for everyone by the network's own decision-making. Then came 2010 and the episodes that would define South Park's most dangerous chapter. To celebrate the show's 200th episode, Parker and Stone created a landmark spectacular that referenced nearly every significant controversy and storyline in the show's history. Every celebrity who had ever been mocked on the show returned to file a class action lawsuit against the town. Tom Cruise assembles them. The only way to make them drop the lawsuit is for the town to produce Muhammad, who apparently possesses a unique superpower, the ability to never be ridiculed. Muhammad appeared in episode 200, but was always obscured, behind a censorship bar, inside a truck, inside a bear costume. The episode aired on April 14th, 2010, to critical acclaim. It was, by any measure, one of the best episodes the show had ever produced. In the week between episode 200 and its conclusion in episode 201, a New York-based extremist organization called Revolution Muslim posted a warning on their website. The post included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in 2004 for making a documentary about violence against women in certain Islamic societies. The post stated that Parker and Stone would probably wind up like Van Gogh for airing their show. The post included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and the production company in Los Angeles. The author of the post, Zachary Adam Chesser, later claimed it was meant as a warning rather than a threat. This distinction was not meaningful to the New York City Police Department, which increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. The FBI opened an investigation, This was no longer a situation about angry letters or pressure campaigns. This was a genuine security threat. Episode 201 aired on April 21, 2010. Without consulting Parker or Stone, on Comedy Central inserted audio bleeps over every mention of Muhammad's name in the episode. They censored multiple lines of dialogue, and they censored almost the entirety of the episode's closing sequence, in which Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus give speeches about not letting fear or violence dictate what can be said in a free society. Comedy Central censored a speech about how you shouldn't give in to threats. The show's own network proved the speech's point by the act of censoring it. Parker and Stone issued a public statement confirming that Comedy Central had added censorship without their knowledge or permission. Jon Stewart dedicated 10 minutes of The Daily Show to the controversy. Bill Maher spoke about it publicly. Senator Joe Lieberman criticized the organization that had made the threats. Zachary Chesser was eventually arrested not primarily for the South Park threats, but for attempting to provide material support to a Somali terrorist organization. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Episodes 200 and 201 were removed from Comedy Central's website, pulled from streaming services, and excluded from syndication. The 2001 episode Super Best Friends, which had never been controversial when it aired, was also pulled because it contained an uncensored depiction of Muhammad. An episode that had existed for 9 years without anyone finding it objectionable became retroactively banned because the context around it had changed so dramatically. In the DVD sets for Season 14, episodes 200 and 201 were simply absent, despite the packaging claiming all 14 episodes were included. While the commentary tracks for those episodes, recorded by Parker and Stone, are largely a long audio bleep. Parker opens the commentary by saying they made the episode as intended and sent it in. Then silence. Stone says, "Yeah, that's pretty much it. They refer to Muhammad throughout the commentary only as the prophet of the Muslim faith. They never speak the name aloud." Parker said later in interviews that this period was genuinely frightening. Not in the abstract way in which controversy is sometimes described as frightening. Actually frightening. Physically, personally frightening. There were security details. There were serious conversations about risk. For several weeks, two of the most successful comedy writers in America were living under a level of threat that most creative people never face. And then, once the crisis passed, they went back to work and kept making the show. That is something worth sitting with quietly in the dark. Section 8. South Park vs. China. October 2nd, 2019. The 299th episode of South Park aired on Comedy Central. It was called Banned in China. It was Season 23, Episode 2. In terms of geopolitical consequence, it may be the most impactful single piece of entertainment content that Comedy Central has ever broadcast. The episode runs two storylines simultaneously. In one, Stan's death metal band gets offered a biopic deal by a film producer. The producer is enthusiastic about their story. But as filming begins, censors arrive. Chinese government censors. They start removing elements of the band's story that might be considered offensive to Chinese audiences. The violence goes. The complicated emotions go. As the authenticity goes. One by one, everything that makes the story true is erased in pursuit of access to the Chinese market. In the other storyline, Randy Marsh travels to China to expand his marijuana business, which he calls Tegrity Farms, a portmanteau of integrity and the farm. He is immediately arrested at the airport. He ends up in a labor camp. And in the labor camp, alongside other political prisoners, Randy meets Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. They're in the Chinese prison system because internet memes comparing the appearance of Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping to the Disney character had resulted in Winnie the Pooh imagery being officially banned in China. The episode directly and without subtlety called out Hollywood studios, the NBA, Disney, Google, Apple, and the entire apparatus of American corporate media for self-censoring their content to maintain access to the Chinese market. It used Randy's Tegrity Farms storyline as a direct metaphor for the compromise of integrity in pursuit of commercial opportunity. It made the argument clearly, you cannot have genuine integrity and also surrender it for money. The word tegrity, repeated throughout the episode, is a joke about the impossibility of that combination. Within days of the episode airing, South Park was completely erased from the Chinese internet. Every clip, every episode, every online discussion, every social media mention disappeared. A search on Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, returned 0 results for South Park among billions of archived posts. The streaming service Youku, which is owned by Alibaba, removed full seasons that had been available. An old discussion thread on a Chinese online forum now displayed a message explaining that the section was temporarily not open according to relevant laws and regulations. A nation of 1.4 billion people had deleted a cartoon. Parker and Stone's response was issued through the show's official Twitter account on October 7, 2019. It read, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May the autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China?" The reference to the NBA was not accidental. In the same week Banned in China aired, as the NBA was in the middle of a crisis involving the Houston Rockets general manager, Daryl Morey, having tweeted support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protest movement. Chinese broadcasters pulled Rockets games. Chinese sponsors withdrew funding. The NBA, an organization that genuinely does have policies protecting the free expression of its players and employees, issued an apology statement suggesting that Morey's comment had deeply offended people and was regrettable. The apology was widely considered embarrassing by American commentators. South Park had aired an episode about exactly this kind of capitulation, been banned for it, and then used their mock apology to directly call out the NBA's actual apology in the same sentence. Bloomberg News later reported that Apple, which has significant manufacturing operations and a large user base in China, was reportedly not going to bid for South Park's streaming rights because of the show's China ban. The controversy was having real commercial consequences for the show and its creators. Parker and Stone continued addressing China's censorship apparatus in subsequent episodes throughout season 23. They did not modify their position. There is a broader argument to be made about this episode's cultural significance. Before Banned in China, the practice of American companies self-censoring their content for Chinese market access was happening quietly, without much public attention. Films were being edited to remove references to Taiwan and Tibet. Games were being changed, music was being reviewed. The scale of the self-censorship, and how many companies were doing it and how often, was not a mainstream public conversation. After Banned in China, it was. Politicians began asking questions about corporate complicity with authoritarian censorship. Journalists began reporting more aggressively on the practice. Audiences began looking more carefully at which films were being altered for Chinese distribution. The conversation shifted. A construction paper cartoon from Colorado contributed to that shift in ways that no number of policy papers or editorial columns could have matched, because comedy reaches people where they're comfortable and then shows them something they hadn't noticed. Section 9. The episodes that quietly changed everything. Not every significant moment in South Park's history arrives with sirens and press releases. Some of the most important episodes are the ones that worked their changes quietly, beneath the headline controversies, in the accumulated weight of what the show said over time. Scott to Norman Must Die Season 5 Episode 4, which aired on July 11, 2001, is considered by many to be the single best episode the show ever produced. It holds a rating of 9.6 out of 10 on IMDb, which for a television episode is almost statistically improbable. The episode involves Cartman being humiliated and tricked by an older boy named Scott Tenorman. Cartman spends the episode plotting increasingly elaborate revenge schemes, all of which fail. And then the final act arrives. Cartman arranges for Scott's parents to be killed by manipulating a series of events involving a farmer and a trespassing accusation. He has their bodies ground into chili. He serves that chili to Scott at a public cook-off. Scott eats his own parents, and then Cartman licks his tears. The episode generated no boycotts, no press releases from religious organizations, no government condemnations. The controversy it produced was quieter and more durable than any of those external reactions. It fundamentally and permanently redefined who Eric Cartman was. Before Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman was a bully and a racist and a thoroughly unpleasant child. After the episode, he was something else entirely. He was a person capable of engineering the deaths of innocent people and then consuming them as part of an elaborate theatrical revenge against their child. Every Cartman episode that came after carries the weight of what he did in that episode, even when it's not acknowledged. Mock, you can never fully relax around the character again. The episode is also a piece of genuinely sophisticated storytelling. The plotting is intricate and deeply premeditated. The reveal in the final minutes requires you to reassemble everything you watched earlier in a completely different light. It does what great literary fiction does. It changes the meaning of everything before it by telling you something at the end. This is not the kind of craft people typically associate with a crude cartoon comedy, but it was always there. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, Season 11, Episode 1, which aired on March 7, 2007, used the N-word 43 times without censorship. An entire episode built around one of the most charged words in the English language, examining how casual use of the word by white people affects the black community. But was received positively by civil rights organizations, including the NAACP. The episode made Randy Marsh look like an absolute fool for using the word on national television, and centered the emotional weight of the episode not on Randy's embarrassment, but on the experience of Token, the only black kid in the South Park school, who has to navigate everyone's reactions to what Randy said. It was arguably more nuanced about race and language than many shows that approach the subject with far more gravity and far fewer profanities. The All About Mormons episode, Season 7, Episode 9, which aired November 19, 2003, presents the founding mythology of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in meticulous detail, accompanied by the repeated visual caption, "Dum dum 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 dum," whenever the story reaches a particularly difficult-to-believe moment. And yet the Mormon Church did not boycott, did not threaten legal action, did not launch a pressure campaign. They essentially shrugged. When Parker heard about this response, he was genuinely impressed. He has talked about feeling actual respect for how the Mormon community handled being mocked. That respect eventually led him and Stone, working with songwriter Robert Lopez, to write The Book of Mormon, which opened on Broadway in 2011, won 9 Tony Awards including Best Musical, and remains one of the most successful Broadway shows of the past 2 decades. The contrast between how Scientology responded to Trapped in the Closet and how the Mormon community responded to All About Mormons is worth dwelling on. Both satirized a religion's founding mythology. Both were irreverent in ways that could reasonably be found offensive. Scientology responded with lawyers, pressure campaigns, and the manipulation of a vulnerable man who could no longer speak for himself. The Mormon community responded with grace and quiet dignity, and from that graceful response came one of the great American musicals. The Scientology response produced one of the great American scandals. Man, Bear, Pig, Season 10, Episode 6, aired in 2006, and depicted Al Gore as a delusional, attention-seeking fool obsessed with a non-existent threat he called Man, Bear, Pig, the episode's obvious metaphor for climate change. The episode came out around the same time as Gore's documentary An Inconvenient Truth. Its message was clear. Climate change is being manufactured and exaggerated for attention. The episode did not generate major institutional controversy at the time. It simply aged badly over a very long time as climate change turned out to be exactly as real and as serious as the scientific consensus had been saying. To their enormous credit, Parker and Stone addressed this directly. In 2018, 12 years after the original episode, they brought back Man, Bear, Pig in a 2-part story. In these episodes, Man, Bear, Pig is real. He is devastating. He is killing people. And the boys apologized to Al Gore for not taking him seriously. They admitted, on screen, in character, as the show they had made, that they had been wrong. But Gore accepts the apology but does so in an annoying and self-congratulatory way, which is peak South Park. Even the correction contains a joke. How many shows in the history of television have issued an in-universe, in-character correction of a factually wrong position they had previously broadcast? The number is very small. Parker and Stone were not required to do this. They could have let the original episode stand or been quietly embarrassed by it. Instead, they made an episode about being wrong. The pandemic specials of 2020 and 2021 represent a genuinely unusual chapter. When COVID-19 hit and the world changed around the show, Parker and Stone produced a series of extended specials rather than regular episodes, releasing them on Paramount Plus rather than Comedy Central. The first special, the pandemic special, she aired on September 30th, 2020, and drew approximately 3.2 million viewers, which was remarkable for cable in an era when linear television audiences were declining sharply. The specials were the subject of their own minor controversy within the show's fan community, some of whom felt that releasing content behind a streaming paywall represented a betrayal of the show's roots as a cable television program. Parker and Stone addressed this tension directly through Randy's Tegrity Farm storyline, in which a character who preaches integrity constantly makes mercenary financial decisions. The self-awareness of this is the only response available to them. They know what they're doing, they acknowledge it, and they do it anyway. Section 10. The Trump Era and the Show That Refuses to Go Quietly. For most of its existence, South Park maintained a position of aggressive political balance. The show mocked environmentalists and gun control advocates, and then turned around and mocked racists and homophobes. It attacked liberal sacred cows and conservative sacred cows with roughly equal enthusiasm. The label that attached itself to this posture was South Park Republican, coined by a writer named Andrew Sullivan to describe young men who were socially liberal but politically skeptical and who appreciated the show's irreverence toward any kind of received orthodoxy. Parker and Stone always rejected this label. Stone has said publicly that he hates conservatives but also really hates liberals. Parker told Rolling Stone at some point that he has never voted in his life. They positioned themselves as people who find anyone with strong convictions slightly ridiculous. And for a long time, that positioning felt genuinely neutral. The Trump era complicated this position in ways that forced the show to evolve. Initially, Parker and Stone chose not to create a direct Trump character. Instead, they used the existing character, Mr. Garrison, the school's peculiar teacher, as a stand-in. Stone explained this decision clearly. Trump was essentially already South Park. He was so absurd, so cartoonish in his public behavior, that parodying him felt impossible because you could not exaggerate what was already extreme. The seasons around the 2016 election created some of the creative turbulence in the show's history. Parker and Stone have been honest about this. Seasons 19 and 20 represented an experiment with season-long serialization, to continuous storylines that built across entire seasons rather than standalone episodes. The experiment was motivated by genuine creative ambition. Parker wanted to make something more complex and sustained. The problem was that the 6-day production schedule, which makes South Park so nimble and responsive, is poorly suited to long-form narrative planning. The storylines required advanced preparation that clashed with the show's fundamental nature. Then the 2016 election happened on a specific night in November while the season was in progress. Parker and Stone have said they had built their election storyline around the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win. When Trump won, they had to rewrite the concluding episodes of the season overnight. The results were, by their own admission, not their best work, and it was the first time the show had been visibly caught off guard by the world it was trying to satirize. Parker has said plainly that the serialization experiment was a mistake, and that they learned something important from it. The show works best when each episode stands on its own. By the time South Park returned after a 2-year hiatus with its 27th season, premiering on July 23, 2025, the show had made a decision. It was going to depict Donald Trump directly. Not through a surrogate, not through a stand-in. Donald Trump himself. The first episode of season 27 is called Sermon on the Mount. In it, Trump is depicted in a relationship with Satan, echoing the show's 1999 depiction of Saddam Hussein as Satan's companion in earlier seasons. There are scenes of Trump in bed with the devil, and the character is depicted with anatomical comedy that was specific enough to generate a 4-day conversation between Parker and the network's Standards and Practices Department. Jesus appears at South Park Elementary because, as he explains, Paramount made a deal with Trump and he is contractually obligated to be there. a direct reference to the Paramount Corporation's legal settlement with the then president over a separate media matter. The episode aired hours after Parker and Stone signed a new deal with Paramount worth a reported $1.5 billion for 50 new episodes. Within 24 hours, the White House issued an official statement condemning the episode. Press Secretary Taylor Rogers called the show fourth-rate and irrelevant and said it was hanging on by a thread. The actual White House, the most powerful executive office on Earth, issued a press release about a construction paper cartoon. It is difficult to improve on the irony of this. The official response, intended to diminish the show's cultural significance, became, almost instantly, the most effective promotional material for the show's return that anyone could have designed. Season 27's second episode averaged 6.2 million global multi-platform viewers in its first 3 days, the highest live ratings on Comedy Central since 2018. The White House had called the show irrelevant. 6 million people watched the next episode. Parker was asked about the White House's condemnation the following day at San Diego Comic-Con International. His response was 2 words delivered with an approximately 5-second deadpan stare. "We're terribly sorry." Now that is the same tone, the same refusal to take the powerful seriously, that has defined every South Park response to institutional pressure since 1997. The mock apology, the slight pause, the return to work. J.D. Vance was depicted in subsequent episodes as Trump's loyal subordinate. Vance responded to his appearance on X with the words, "Well, I've finally made it." Kristi Noem was depicted in one episode undergoing plastic surgery and then going on a puppy-killing rampage, a reference to a passage in her autobiography in which she described shooting her family's dog. The current season continues to address the Trump administration weekly, with the same 6-day production cycle translating events from the news into construction paper animation at the speed of a late-night talk show. Sha Parker has described the shift from the show's previous political posture with useful clarity. He has explained that they spent years being frustrated by what they saw as the greatest threat to comedy: political correctness, the reflexive policing of language and ideas that seemed to make comedy impossible. Trump showed them, he said, that there was something worse than political correctness, a political movement that operates outside any shared understanding of what is true. Satire requires a shared baseline of reality. You cannot satirize something effectively if the audience has no common reference point for what the satirized thing actually is. Political correctness was annoying, but it existed within reality. What Parker and Stone perceived as the MAGA media ecosystem posed a different kind of challenge to what they do. Now, whether you agree with that analysis or not, it explains why the show has directed its satirical energy the way it has in recent seasons. This is not the show abandoning neutrality in favor of partisanship. It is the show responding to where the show's creators perceive the most extreme absurdity to currently be located. Section 11. The Legacy and the Numbers. Let's talk about what the show actually is in terms of the concrete, measurable things that can be counted and cited. South Park premiered on August 13th, 1997. As of the 28th season, which premiered on October 16th, 2025, the show has broadcast over 330 episodes. Across more than 2 decades of continuous production, it has been on the air longer than many of its viewers have been alive. The show has received 4 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Animated Program. It won in 2005 for Best Friends Forever, in 2006 for Make Love Not Warcraft, in 2009 for Margaritaville, and in 2012 for Raising the Bar. The Imagination Land trilogy won a separate Emmy in 2008 for Outstanding Animated Program for programming 1 hour or more. The Television Academy has essentially been acknowledging, repeatedly and over many years, that one of the most controversial programs on American television is also some of the finest work being done in its format. In 2021, Parker and Stone signed a deal with Viacom-CBS reported to be worth $900 million, covering new seasons through 2027 plus multiple streaming specials for Paramount Plus. In 2025, that deal expanded with the new agreement reportedly worth $1.5 billion for 50 additional episodes and exclusive streaming rights. For a show that began as a $750 Christmas card, these are numbers that require a moment of quiet reflection. The show's impact on the broader entertainment landscape is harder to quantify but difficult to overstate. Family Guy premiered in 1999. Adult Swim launched in 2001. The entire infrastructure of adult animation on American television that exists today owes something to what South Park demonstrated was commercially viable. Before South Park, The Simpsons was the ceiling of what adult animation was understood to be capable of doing in terms of content and ambition. South Park demolished that ceiling in the first season and kept going. The show has been banned outright by China. Russia has banned specific episodes on multiple occasions. New Zealand launched a court challenge against an episode. Australia refused to air another episode for 11 years before quietly broadcasting it. Multiple countries in the Middle East have restricted the show's availability for years. The Parents Television Council has campaigned against it consistently for nearly 3 decades. Religious organizations representing billions of people have condemned specific episodes. The White House has called it irrelevant. An actual extremist organization made credible threats against its creators, and the show kept going. 6 episodes out of more than 300 have been effectively banned or pulled from legal distribution. That is less than 2% of the show's output. The other 98+% has survived everything. There is a Matt Stone quote that has stayed in the conversation around this show for years. He said something along the lines of, "You cannot do satire if there are certain things you are not allowed to make fun of." The principle that satire requires complete freedom of subject, that the moment you designate something as off-limits, the entire enterprise is compromised, runs through the show like a single sustained note. You can agree or disagree with how they've applied it. You can find specific episodes unfair or poorly executed or harmful in their effects. You can make the reasonable argument that equal opportunity offense is not actually neutral in a society where different groups have different levels of social power. All of those criticisms are available and many of them land. But the commitment to the principle held consistently for more than a quarter century against escalating and sometimes frightening pressure is something. Whatever else you think about South Park, it has not flinched. Not once. Not when the Parents Television Council was writing letters. Not when Scientology was mobilizing its lawyers. Not when Comedy Central was censoring their episode about censorship. Not when death threats arrived with home addresses attached. Not when an entire government erased them from a national internet. Not when the White House called them irrelevant. They kept making the same show. 4 construction paper kids in a small Colorado town saying the things nobody else would say. Parker has talked about the experience of being controversial for nearly 3 decades, and there's something he returns to that seems true. He says that the anxiety is never about whether something will be offensive. The anxiety is always about whether it will be funny. The controversy is a byproduct of trying to find the truth in any given situation, and then expressing it in the most absurd, most appropriate, most genuinely funny way they can. The fear is not of upsetting someone. The fear is of being bad. That is, in a way, the least controversial thing about the show. The people making it are trying to make something good, something that works on its own terms, something that makes each other laugh. The controversies happen because the things that make them laugh keep turning out to be things that powerful people, governments, corporations, churches, and in one memorable week, the actual White House would prefer not to be said out loud. And there it is. 28 seasons, 1 Christmas card, $750. The same show it's always been, made by the same 2 guys from Colorado, still doing the voices that cracked each other up in a film class in 1992, still running the same play, still saying, "We're terribly sorry." And then getting back to work. If you've made it all the way here, thank you genuinely for spending this time. There are few things better than letting something interesting settle into your mind in the quiet. If you enjoyed this, a comment, a like, and a subscription genuinely help the channel more than most people realize. Tell me below where you're watching from tonight and one South Park episode that lives rent-free in your memory. Until next time, wherever you are, rest well.